In the small town of Millbrook, Tennessee, 18-year-old Rachel Martinez clutched her worn duffel bag as she stood on the front porch of the only home she'd ever known. The autumn wind cut through her thin jacket, carrying with it the sound of her father's voice still echoing from inside the house, words that had shattered her world just moments before. Behind the lace curtains, she could see the shadows of her family moving about their evening routine, continuing their lives as if she had never existed. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach, where a secret she'd carried for 6 weeks had just cost her everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The decision to tell them had taken every ounce of courage Rachel possessed. She'd rehearsed the words 100 times, imagining different scenarios, hoping against hope that love would triumph over disappointment. Instead, she'd watched her mother's face crumble, heard her father's voice rise to a pitch she'd never heard before, and felt the foundation of her 18 years crack beneath her feet. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across Millbrook's quiet streets, Rachel faced the terrifying reality of having nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The Martinez family had been pillars of their small community for 3 generations. Her grandfather had opened the first hardware store on Main Street. Her father had expanded it into a thriving business, and Rachel had grown up believing she would somehow carry on that legacy. She'd been the good daughter, the one who made honor roll every semester, who volunteered at church functions, who had never given her parents a moment's worry. Until now, Rachel's mind wandered back to 3 months ago, when everything had seemed so different. She'd been dating Kevin Walsh, the quarterback from the neighboring town of Cedar Falls, since her junior year. He was everything her parents had wanted for her: polite, ambitious, from a good family. They'd made plans together, talked about college, about the future. But when she'd called him 2 weeks ago with the news that would change everything, his response had been swift and brutal. "That's not my problem," he'd said, his voice cold and distant. "Figure it out yourself." The line had gone dead, and with it, any illusion Rachel had harbored about young love conquering all. Standing on that porch, Rachel replayed the conversation that had led to this moment. Her mother, Elena Martinez, had been preparing dinner in their familiar kitchen when Rachel had finally gathered the courage to speak. The smell of her mother's famous enchiladas had filled the air, a comfort that now seemed like a luxury from another lifetime. "Mama," Rachel had begun, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something important." Elena had looked up from the stove, her dark eyes immediately registering concern at her daughter's tone. "What is it, Mia? You look pale." Rachel's father, Miguel, had chosen that moment to enter the kitchen, his work boots echoing on the tile floor. At 52, he was still an imposing figure, his hands calloused from years of honest labor, his presence commanding respect throughout their small town. He'd taken one look at his daughter's face and known something was terribly wrong. "I'm pregnant," Rachel had whispered, the words falling into the kitchen like stones into still water. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's wooden spoon had clattered to the floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden quiet. Miguel's face had gone through a series of transformations: shock, disbelief, and finally, a hurt so deep it seemed to age him years in seconds. "No," Elena had breathed, shaking her head as if she could deny reality into existence. "No, Rachel, tell me this isn't true." But Rachel's tears had been confirmation enough. What followed was a storm of emotions: her mother's sobs, her father's thunderous demands for details, her own stammering attempts to explain how careful she'd thought she was being, how this wasn't supposed to happen. "Who?" Miguel had demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Who did this to you?" "It wasn't like that, Papa," Rachel had tried to explain. "Kevin and I, we love each other." "Love?" Miguel's laugh had been bitter and sharp. "Where is this boy who loves you now? Where is he when you need him most?" Rachel had no answer for that. Kevin's rejection still stung like an open wound, his cowardice a betrayal that cut deeper than her parents' anger. She'd tried to explain that she'd reached out to him, that he'd refused to even discuss their situation, but her words only seemed to fuel her father's fury. "You've disgraced this family," Miguel had said, his voice low and dangerous. 3 generations we've built our reputation in this town, and you throw it away for what? A boy who won't even stand by you? Elena had tried to play peacemaker, her natural maternal instincts warring with her deep religious convictions and social fears. "Miguel, she's our daughter." "Not anymore," he'd cut her off, the words like physical blows. "I won't have this. Shame under my roof. I won't have the whole town talking about how the Martinez family raised a daughter who—" He couldn't even finish the sentence, his disgust too complete for words. Rachel had pleaded with them, tears streaming down her face, as she tried to make them understand. She'd promised to be careful, to keep the pregnancy quiet, to find a way to handle everything without bringing embarrassment to the family. But Miguel's mind was made up, his traditional values and community standing more important than his daughter's. "Welfare, you have 1 hour," he'd said with terrible finality. "Pack your things and get out. Don't come back until you've dealt with this situation properly." "Miguel, no," Elena had sobbed, but her husband's glare had silenced her protests. The weight of generations of traditional expectations, of small-town judgment, of religious doctrine, had proven stronger than parental love. Now Rachel stood in the growing darkness, her entire life condensed into a single duffel bag. Inside were a few changes of clothes, her high school yearbook, a photo of her and her parents from last Christmas when they'd all been smiling, and the small amount of money she'd saved from her part-time job at the local diner. It wasn't nearly enough to start a new life, especially not with a baby on the way. The streets of Millbrook were eerily quiet as Rachel began walking, her footsteps echoing off the well-maintained sidewalks. She passed the hardware store that bore her family's name, its windows dark and empty. 3 generations of Martinez pride and tradition, now nothing more than a painful reminder of what she'd lost. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very values that had shaped her, honesty, integrity, courage, were the same ones that had led her to tell the truth and face the consequences. Rachel's feet carried her automatically toward the town center, past familiar landmarks that now felt foreign and unwelcoming. The old Presbyterian church where she'd attended services every Sunday since childhood loomed ahead, its white steeple cutting a stark silhouette against the darkening sky. She wondered if Reverend Phillips, who had baptized her and confirmed her, would show the same mercy her own father had denied her. As she reached the town square, Rachel sank onto a bench beneath the old oak tree that had stood there for over a century. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more daunting than the last. She had her high school diploma, but no college plans now. She had work experience, but nothing that would support a child. Most importantly, she had no family support, no safety net to catch her if she fell. The cool autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of families enjoying their evening routines, dinners being prepared, children being called in from play, the comfortable rhythms of normal life that Rachel no longer had access to. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and tried to think practically about her immediate needs. She needed shelter for the night, food, and most urgently, she needed to figure out what came next. Rachel thought about the other girls in her high school class who had faced similar situations. Most had either married quickly or quietly disappeared to visit relatives in distant cities, returning months later with no one speaking of what had transpired. Neither of those options was available to her now. Kevin had made his position clear, and her family had closed their door permanently. The town's main street stretched out before her, lined with businesses she'd known all her life. Martinez Hardware sat dark and imposing, a reminder of the legacy she'd been cut from. The Millbrook diner where she'd worked after school showed warm light through its windows, But Rachel knew she couldn't go back there. Word would spread quickly. In a town this size, and she couldn't bear the weight of everyone's stares and whispered judgments. As she sat there, Rachel felt the first real wave of terror wash over her. This wasn't just about disappointing her parents or facing social judgment. This was about survival. She was 18 years old, pregnant, and completely alone. The baby inside her was barely the size of a grape, but it already represented a responsibility that seemed overwhelming in its magnitude. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her cell phone, scrolling through her contacts with desperate hope. Most of her friends were classmates who were either away at college or still living under their parents' watchful eyes. Her best friend, Maria Santos, had moved to Nashville for nursing school and was struggling financially herself. Rachel's finger hovered over Maria's number, but pride stopped her from making the call. What could she say? That her perfect life had imploded in a single evening. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made Rachel look up from her phone. An elderly woman was walking her small terrier, both of them moving slowly in the cool evening air. Rachel recognized her as Mrs. Thompson, who lived 2 streets over from her family's house. The woman's eyes met Rachel's briefly, and recognition flickered across her weathered features. But instead of stopping to chat as she might have on any other evening, Mrs. Thompson looked away and hurried past, her dog trotting obediently beside her. The snub was subtle but unmistakable, and it drove home the reality of Rachel's new situation. In a town like Millbrook, news traveled fast and social judgment was swift. By morning, everyone would know that Miguel Martinez had thrown his daughter out of the house. The speculation about why would follow soon after, and Rachel's reputation would be destroyed beyond repair. As darkness settled over the town square, Rachel realized she needed to make some immediate decisions. The October air was growing colder, and she couldn't spend the night on a park bench. She had maybe $60 in her wallet, enough for a cheap motel room if she could find one, but that was money she couldn't afford to waste if she was going to survive the coming weeks. Rachel stood up from the bench and began walking toward the edge of town, where she remembered seeing a small motel during her drives with Kevin. The neon sign was flickering and half the letters were burned out, but it was better than sleeping outdoors. As she walked, she tried to formulate a plan that extended beyond tonight. First, she needed to find work, something that would provide enough income to support herself and eventually a baby. Her experience at the diner was relevant, and restaurants were always looking for reliable help. The problem was that in a small town, her reputation would follow her everywhere. She might need to leave Millbrook entirely, start fresh somewhere nobody knew her family or her story. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Second, she needed medical care. The pregnancy was still early, but she knew she should see a doctor soon. The question was how to afford it without insurance or family support. Public health clinics existed, but the nearest one was probably in Nashville, over an hour's drive away. Third, and most daunting, she needed to decide what to do about the baby itself. At 18, with no support system and no financial resources, raising a child seemed nearly impossible. But the alternatives, adoption, or the option her father had hinted at when he'd said she needed to deal with this situation properly, were almost equally overwhelming to contemplate. The motel's parking lot was nearly empty when Rachel finally reached it. Just a few beat-up cars and one long-haul truck suggesting that business wasn't exactly booming. The office was lit by a harsh, fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows through the grimy windows. Rachel took a deep breath, adjusted her duffel bag on her shoulder, and pushed through the glass door. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, watching the small television with poor reception. He looked up when Rachel entered, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, just the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen too many desperate travelers over the years. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "Yes, please," Rachel replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just for tonight." The man quoted a price that was higher than she'd hoped, but still within her limited budget. As she counted out the bills, Rachel noticed his eyes taking in her youthful appearance, her small duffel bag, the general air of someone who'd been cut loose from their normal life. But he didn't ask questions, for which she was grateful. Room was small and sparse, with a bed that had seen better decades and a bathroom that smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. But it was warm and private, which was all Rachel needed for now. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to fully process what had happened. In the space of a few hours, her entire identity had been stripped away. She was no longer Miguel and Elena Martinez's daughter, no longer a college-bound honor student, no longer a girl with a clear path into the future. She was just Rachel, 18 and pregnant and alone, with nothing but the clothes in her bag and a few dollars to her name. The tears came then, hot and overwhelming, carrying with them all the grief and terror and exhaustion of the day. She cried for the family she'd lost, for the future that had been stolen from her, for the baby who would grow up knowing they'd been unwanted by their own grandparents. She cried until she was empty, until the well of tears ran dry and left only a hollow ache in her chest. When the crying stopped, Rachel found herself staring at the water-stained ceiling, her mind surprisingly clear for the first time all day. The situation was terrible, but it wasn't hopeless. She was young, healthy, and intelligent. She had a high school education and work experience. Most importantly, she had something that many people lost along the way, the ability to start completely over. Tomorrow she would need to make concrete plans. She would look for work, research her options, figure out how to build a life from nothing. But tonight, in this shabby motel room that represented the lowest point of her young life, Rachel Martinez made a decision that would define everything that came after. She was going to survive this. More than that, she was going to build something good from the wreckage of her old life. The baby inside her wasn't a mistake or a burden, it was a new beginning. A chance to create the kind of unconditional love she'd thought she'd had, but clearly hadn't. As sleep finally claimed her, Rachel's hand rested protectively over her stomach. And for the first time since that terrible conversation in her mother's kitchen, she felt something other than despair. It was small and fragile, but it was their hope. The morning would bring new challenges, new fears, new obstacles to overcome. But it would also bring new possibilities, new chances to prove that strength could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the end of one story was really just the beginning of another. Rachel woke to the sound of rain pelting against the motel window, each drop seeming to echo the uncertainty that had settled into her bones overnight. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed a harsh red 6:47 a.m., and the gray light filtering through the thin curtains suggested that the weather matched her mood perfectly. Her first night alone had been restless, filled with dreams of her mother's cooking and nightmares of empty highways stretching endlessly ahead. The $43 remaining in her wallet wouldn't stretch far enough for another night at the motel, which meant today she needed to find both work and a more permanent place to stay. Rachel splashed cold water on her face in the tiny bathroom mirror, studying her reflection for any visible signs of the pregnancy that had turned her world upside down. Her olive skin looked pale, her dark eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but otherwise, she appeared unchanged. It seemed impossible that such a monumental shift in her life could leave so little physical evidence. After gathering her meager belongings, Rachel checked out of the motel and began walking toward downtown Millbrook, the rain soaking through her inadequate jacket within minutes. The streets that had seemed so familiar yesterday now felt foreign and unwelcoming, as if the town itself was rejecting her presence. She passed the elementary school where she'd learned to read, the playground where she'd skinned her knees countless times, the ice cream shop where her father had taken her every birthday until she turned 16 and decided she was too old for such traditions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now walking past these monuments to her childhood while carrying a child of her own. At 18, she felt simultaneously too young to be facing these adult responsibilities and too old to go back to the innocence these places represented. The rain continued its steady assault as she made her way toward the business district, each step taking her further from the safety of her former life. Her first stop was Rosie's Family Restaurant, a local institution that had been serving comfort food to Millbrook residents for over 30 years. Rachel had eaten there countless times with her family after church on Sundays, always ordering the same stack of pancakes with extra syrup. Now she stood outside its steamed-up windows, gathering courage to walk inside and ask for work from people who had watched her grow up. The breakfast rush was in full swing when Rachel pushed through the glass door, the familiar sounds and smells of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee creating a temporary sense of normalcy. Rosie Chun, the restaurant's owner and head cook, looked up from the grill with a smile that faltered slightly when she recognized her unexpected visitor. "Rachel Martinez," Rosie said, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. "What brings you in so early on a school day? Shouldn't you be getting ready for classes?" The question hit Rachel like a physical blow, reminding her that the rest of the world hadn't caught up to her new reality yet. "I graduated last spring, Mrs. Chun," she managed to say, though her voice sounded smaller than she'd intended. "I was actually hoping to talk to you about work. I have experience from the diner across town, and I'm looking for a full-time position." Rosie's expression shifted from confusion to concern as she took in Rachel's damp clothes and the subtle desperation in her voice. "Full-time? What about college? Your parents were so proud when you got accepted to Tennessee State." Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of explaining her situation to someone who had known her since childhood settling heavily on her shoulders. "Plans change," she said simply, hoping Rosie wouldn't press for details. But Rosie Chun hadn't built a successful restaurant by being unobservant. She studied Rachel's face for a long moment, taking in the signs of a sleepless night and the way the girl's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her jacket closed. "Come with me," she said finally, leading Rachel to a booth in the back corner where they could talk privately. "What's really going on, honey?" Rosie asked, her voice gentle but direct. "Yesterday you had family and college plans, and today you're standing in my restaurant looking like you've been sleeping rough. That doesn't happen without a story." Rachel stared down at the table, tracing patterns in the worn formica with her finger. Part of her wanted to pour out the whole truth to this kind woman who had always treated her with maternal warmth. But another part, the part that had been raised to protect the family's reputation above all else, held her back. "I had a disagreement with my parents," she said carefully, "about my future plans. I've decided I need to be more independent, make my own way in the world." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Rosie's expression suggested she wasn't buying the simplified version, but she didn't push. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook and pen from her apron pocket. "I do need help," she admitted. "My morning waitress just gave notice last week, and the breakfast rush has been killing me. But I need someone reliable, someone who won't disappear the minute something better comes along. Can you promise me that?" "Yes, ma'am," Rachel said quickly, relief flooding through her voice. "I promise. I need this job more than you know." Rosie studied her for another moment, then nodded. $6 an hour plus tips, 5 days a week to start, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. You'll need to get a food handler's permit, and I'll want to see your references from the other diner. When can you start?" "Tomorrow," Rachel said immediately. "Today if you need me. Tomorrow's fine. But Rachel?" Rosie leaned forward, her expression serious. Whatever's really going on with you, whatever trouble you're in, running away from your problems isn't usually the answer. Sometimes the people who love us surprise us with their capacity for forgiveness. Rachel nodded, not trusting herself to speak. If only Rosie knew how final her father's words had been, how complete his rejection. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. After leaving the restaurant with the promise of steady employment, Rachel's next challenge was finding affordable housing. The classified ads in the local newspaper offered few options, and most required the first month's rent, plus a security deposit that was far beyond her means. She spent the afternoon walking from one rental listing to another, each rejection adding weight to the growing despair in her chest. By 4 o'clock, with the rain still falling and her shoes thoroughly soaked, Rachel found herself standing outside a modest duplex on Elm Street, about a mile from downtown. The for rent sign in the yard was hand-painted and slightly crooked, suggesting this might be a more informal arrangement than the others she'd encountered. The woman who answered her knock was in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and paint-stained fingers that suggested an artistic hobby. She introduced herself as Dorothy Walsh, no relation to Kevin despite the shared surname, a fact that brought Rachel enormous relief. "You're Miguel Martinez's daughter," Dorothy said immediately, her tone neutral but observant. "I bought hinges from his store just last week. Good quality hardware, fair prices." Rachel braced herself for another awkward conversation about her family's expectations and her failure to meet them. Instead, Dorothy simply asked, "You looking for a place to live?" "Yes, ma'am," Rachel replied. "I saw your sign. I can provide references and pay the first month's rent, but I'm still working on the security deposit." Dorothy studied her with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see more than Rachel was comfortable revealing. "Come inside and look at the place. We can discuss terms after you decide if you want it." The apartment was small but clean, with a tiny kitchen, a living room that could barely fit a couch and coffee table, and a bedroom with a window that looked out onto a modest backyard. The rent was more manageable than the other places she'd seen, but still represented a significant portion of what she'd earn at Rosie's. "I'll be honest with you," Dorothy said as they finished the tour. "I'm not in this for the money. My late husband left me well provided for, and I rent this place mostly to have someone nearby in case I need help. I've had college students here before, and they were more trouble than they were worth. Parties, noise, no respect for property." She paused, studying Rachel's face. "You don't strike me as the party type, though. You strike me as someone who's carrying adult responsibilities before you're quite ready for them." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Rachel felt her carefully constructed composure wavering. "I'm very responsible," she managed to say. "I won't cause any trouble." "I believe you," Dorothy said. "Here's what I'm thinking. You pay me what you can for the first month, and we'll work out a payment plan for the rest. In exchange, you help me with some of the heavier chores around here, yard work, moving furniture, that sort of thing. Does that sound fair?" Rachel felt tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a virtual stranger. "Yes, ma'am. That sounds more than fair. But why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Dorothy smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something genuinely warm. "Because 35 years ago, I was a young woman who needed help and couldn't ask for it from the people who should have provided it. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most, and I've been looking for opportunities to pay that forward ever since." As Rachel signed the simple rental agreement Dorothy had handwritten, she found herself wondering about the older woman's story. What circumstances had left her needing help 3 decades ago? What kindness had she received that she was now extending to a desperate teenager? "There's a grocery store 2 blocks away," Dorothy said, handing Rachel a set of keys. "And the bus line runs past here if you need to get around town." The apartment comes furnished with basics: bed, dresser, small table, a few dishes. Nothing fancy but functional. That evening, Rachel sat in her new home, the first place she'd ever lived that was truly hers, and tried to process the rapid changes of the past 24 hours. She had work starting tomorrow, a roof over her head, and a landlady who seemed willing to be patient with her circumstances. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a foundation she could build on. The apartment felt enormous after the cramped motel room, despite its modest size. Rachel unpacked her few belongings, hanging her clothes in the small closet and placing her high school yearbook on the single bookshelf. The photograph of her family went on the nightstand beside her bed, where she could see their smiling faces but wouldn't be confronted by them every waking moment. As night fell, Rachel found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the lights of Millbrook twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, her parents were probably finishing their dinner, watching television in their comfortable living room, perhaps beginning to wonder if they'd been too harsh. But she knew her father too well to believe he would relent. Miguel Martinez was a man of unwavering principles, and once he made a decision, he stuck to it regardless of the personal cost. The pregnancy symptoms she'd been dreading began asserting themselves over the next few days. Waves of nausea struck without warning, usually during the busy breakfast rush at Rosie's when she could least afford to show weakness. She learned to keep crackers in her apron pocket and to step outside for fresh air when the smell of bacon became overwhelming. Rosie noticed, of course. The restaurant owner had an eagle eye for her employees' well-being, and Rachel's occasional green-tinged complexion didn't escape her attention. "You feeling all right, honey?" Rosie asked one particularly challenging morning when Rachel had barely made it to the back alley before losing her breakfast. "You've been looking peaked lately." "Just tired," Rachel deflected, splashing cold water on her face at the prep sink. Still adjusting to the new schedule, but Rosie's expression remained concerned. "Rachel, I hope you know you can talk to me if something's wrong. I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's carrying more than their share of troubles." The offer was tempting. Rosie's maternal warmth reminded Rachel painfully of what she'd lost when her own mother chose loyalty to her husband over loyalty to her daughter. But the risk of losing her job if the truth came out was too great to chance. "I'm fine," Rachel insisted, forcing a smile. "Really, just need to get used to being on my feet all day." Her tips from the breakfast shift were better than she'd expected. Thanks to her genuine warmth with customers and her ability to remember their usual orders after just a few visits. The regulars, construction workers grabbing coffee before job sites, retirees meeting friends for their daily social hour, working mothers stealing a few minutes of peace before starting their day, began asking for her section specifically. One customer in particular stood out. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was a pediatrician who stopped by every Tuesday and Thursday for coffee and a blueberry muffin before heading to her practice. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands, and she always treated Rachel with the same respect she showed everyone else, never talking down to her or making her feel insignificant. "You're new here," Dr. Hendricks observed during her second visit, not making it a question but leaving room for Rachel to respond if she chose. "Yes, ma'am, just started this week," Rachel replied, refilling the doctor's coffee cup. "I'm Rachel Martinez." "Patricia Hendricks," the doctor said, extending her hand for a proper introduction. "Are you from Millbrook originally?" The question was casual, but Rachel sensed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Born and raised," she confirmed. "Just making some changes in my life." Dr. Hendricks nodded thoughtfully. "Change can be challenging, but it's often necessary for growth. If you ever need medical care and don't have insurance, my practice has a sliding fee program. Not many young people know that such options exist." The offer was made casually, without prying or judgment, but Rachel filed the information away carefully. She would need prenatal care soon. and her current resources were nowhere near adequate for private medical bills. As her second week at Rosie's progressed, Rachel began to feel a tentative sense of stability. Her morning routine involved a 20-minute walk to work, 8 hours of bustling activity serving customers and learning Rosie's systems, then the afternoon free to handle errands and rest before repeating the cycle. It wasn't the future she'd dreamed of, but it had a rhythm she could depend on. The pregnancy was becoming harder to hide, though the physical changes were still minimal. It was the subtle shifts, her heightened sense of smell, the way certain foods that had always been favorites now turned her stomach, the exhaustion that seemed to seep into her bones, regardless of how much sleep she got, that reminded her constantly of the life growing inside her. Rachel found herself talking to the baby during her walks home from work, sharing observations about their new town and promising that everything would work out somehow. These one-sided conversations felt less lonely than the silence that otherwise filled her days, and they helped her begin to think of the pregnancy as something other than a crisis to be managed. "We're going to be okay," she would whisper, one hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to figure this out together." The words were as much for her own reassurance as for the tiny life she carried, a daily affirmation that survival was possible even when the path forward remained unclear. Each day brought small victories, enough tips to buy groceries, a kind word from a customer, the growing confidence that she could handle whatever challenges arose. But late at night, alone in her small apartment, Rachel still grieved for the family she'd lost and the future that had been stolen from her. The hurt was a constant ache, like a broken bone that hadn't been properly set. She wondered if her parents thought about her, if they regretted their harsh words, if they ever considered reaching out. Most of all, she wondered if love was supposed to be conditional, if the unconditional acceptance she'd always believed her family felt for her had been an illusion all along. The baby inside her would never know their grandparents, never experience the warmth and security Rachel had taken for granted for 18 years. That realization strengthened her resolve in unexpected ways. Whatever kind of parent she became, she would never make her love dependent on her child's perfect behavior. The life growing inside her would know, from their very first breath, that they were wanted and cherished exactly as they were. As her third week in the apartment began, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced since that terrible night when her world had collapsed. Hope for the future. It was fragile and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through snow, but it was real. She was building something new from nothing, creating a life that belonged entirely to her. The hardest part was still ahead. She would need to figure out medical care, plan for the financial realities of raising a child, and somehow find the strength to do it all alone. But she had proven to herself that she could survive the unthinkable, and that knowledge gave her courage to face whatever came next. Standing at her kitchen window as another day dawned over Millbrook, Rachel placed both hands on her stomach and made a promise that would shape everything that followed. "I'm going to give you the best life I can," she whispered, "and I'm going to make sure you always know you're loved." The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since her world had been turned upside down, Rachel believed that uncertainty might hold possibilities as well as challenges. She was no longer the sheltered daughter of Miguel and Elena Martinez. She was Rachel Martinez, soon-to-be mother, survivor, and builder of new dreams. The woman she was becoming was stronger than the girl she had been, and that strength would have to be enough for both of them. 3 weeks into her new routine, Rachel's carefully constructed world nearly crumbled during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. She was refilling coffee for the breakfast regulars when a familiar voice cut through the restaurant's cheerful chatter like a blade. Kevin Walsh stood at the hostess station, his letterman jacket still draped over his broad shoulders, as if he were still the high school quarterback who ruled the hallways. Just months ago, Rachel's hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. her morning sickness suddenly amplified by the sight of the boy who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Kevin's eyes scanned the restaurant until they found her, and the expression that crossed his face was a mixture of surprise, guilt, and something that looked almost like disgust. "Rachel?" He approached her table, his voice carrying the false confidence she now recognized as cowardice dressed up in bravado. "What are you doing here? I heard you were going to college." The customers at the nearby tables had gone quiet, sensing drama in the air. Rachel was acutely aware that her response would be remembered and repeated throughout Millbrook before the lunch rush began. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Plans change," she replied coolly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Some of us have to work for a living." Kevin shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for her composed response. He'd probably expected tears or pleading, the kind of emotional scene that would allow him to position himself as the victim. Instead, he was faced with a young woman who looked tired but determined, someone who had clearly moved beyond needing his approval or support. "Look, about what happened," he began, lowering his voice as if privacy could somehow erase the public nature of his abandonment. "I think we should talk." "There's nothing to discuss," Rachel said firmly, picking up her coffee pot and moving toward another table. "You made your position very clear." But Kevin followed her, his discomfort now tinged with something that looked like panic. "Rachel, wait. I've been thinking about everything, and maybe I was too hasty. Maybe we can work something out." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. For weeks, Rachel had desperately hoped for exactly this conversation, praying that Kevin would reconsider his cold rejection and offer the support she so desperately needed. Now, hearing his words, she realized that his change of heart had nothing to do with love or responsibility and everything to do with his own guilty conscience. "Work something out?" Rachel repeated, her voice carrying a bitter edge she didn't try to hide. "You mean now that you've had time to think about how this reflects on you, you've decided to play the hero?" Kevin's face flushed red, his discomfort now obvious to everyone watching. "That's not fair. I was shocked when you told me. I needed time to process everything." "You needed time," Rachel said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain professional. "I needed support. I needed someone who claimed to love me to act like it when things got difficult. You chose to disappear instead." Rosie Chun appeared as if from nowhere, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone pleasant but with steel underneath. "Rachel, is this young man bothering you?" The intervention gave Rachel the strength to end the conversation on her terms. "Kevin was just leaving," she said firmly. "He doesn't have anything I need." Kevin looked between Rachel and Rosie, clearly recognizing that he was outnumbered and unwelcome. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but his words carried no real threat, just the empty bluster of someone who had lost control of the situation. "Yes, it is," Rachel replied with finality. "It was over the moment you hung up the phone." After Kevin left, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though Rachel was aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed her for the rest of her shift. Rosie kept a protective eye on her, finding reasons to stay nearby and offering silent support through her presence. During her afternoon break, Rachel walked to the small park behind the restaurant to clear her head and process the encounter. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter to come. She sat on a weathered picnic table, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach where her baby continued to grow, oblivious to the drama surrounding their existence. The confrontation with Kevin had crystallized something important for Rachel. She was no longer the naive girl who had believed in fairy tale endings and perfect love. The woman she was becoming understood that real strength came from within, that depending on others for validation or support was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but she recognized Kevin's writing style immediately. "We need to talk. This affects me too." She deleted the message without responding, blocking his number before he could send another. That chapter of her life was closed, and she had no intention of reopening it. The next few days brought their own challenges. Rachel's morning sickness intensified, making the early breakfast shift increasingly difficult to manage. She found herself making frequent trips to the restaurant's small bathroom, trying to compose herself between waves of nausea that seemed to strike without warning. Dr. Hendricks noticed the change during her regular Thursday morning visit. She watched Rachel pour coffee with hands that shook slightly, observed the pale complexion and the careful way she moved, as if sudden movements might trigger unwanted consequences. "Rachel," Dr. Hendricks said gently as she prepared to leave, "I meant what I said about my practice's sliding fee program. Sometimes health issues can't wait for perfect circumstances." The doctor's words hung in the air long after she'd left. Rachel knew she needed prenatal care, but the thought of walking into a medical office and confirming her pregnancy to another adult felt overwhelming. As long as she avoided doctors, she could maintain the illusion that her situation was temporary, that somehow everything might return to the way it was before. But the baby inside her was growing regardless of her avoidance, and Rachel's practical nature eventually overcame her emotional resistance. That afternoon, she called Dr. Hendricks' office and scheduled an appointment, her voice steady as she explained her situation to the receptionist. "Dr. Hendricks mentioned me," Rachel said. "I'm uninsured but interested in the sliding fee program." The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Rachel several days to prepare herself mentally for the reality of medical confirmation. She spent those days researching pregnancy information online at the public library, reading about fetal development and prenatal nutrition with the dedication of a student preparing for the most important exam of her life. Dorothy Walsh proved to be an unexpectedly perceptive landlady. She noticed Rachel's pallor, the way she moved more carefully in the mornings, the changes in her eating habits that became apparent during their brief encounters in the shared backyard. "You know," Dorothy said one evening as they worked together to rake the fallen leaves from her small lawn, "I have a box of herbal teas that might help with an upset stomach. Ginger and peppermint, mostly. Natural remedies that have been helping women for generations." The offer was made casually, without prying questions or judgmental observations. Rachel accepted gratefully, recognizing the kindness beneath Dorothy's matter-of-fact delivery. The older woman's teas did help, providing relief from the worst of the morning sickness and giving Rachel a sense of being cared for that she'd been missing since leaving her family home. Their working relationship evolved into something approaching friendship over the following weeks. Dorothy was a retired art teacher who had spent 40 years helping young people navigate difficult transitions, and her instincts for when to offer support and when to maintain respectful distance were finely tuned. She began leaving small gifts. For Rachel, homemade soup when she seemed particularly tired, extra blankets as the weather grew colder, books from her personal library that she thought a young woman might enjoy. Never anything elaborate or expensive, just quiet acknowledgments that Rachel's well-being mattered to someone. The medical appointment with Dr. Hendricks confirmed what Rachel already knew, but made it official in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. The pregnancy was progressing normally, the baby measuring exactly as expected for someone in their 11th week. Dr. Hendricks was professional and kind, explaining options without judgment and providing information about resources available to young mothers. "You're healthy and strong," the doctor said as she completed the examination. "This baby is lucky to have a mother who's taking such good care of herself under difficult circumstances." The words brought tears to Rachel's eyes, the first truly positive assessment of her situation she'd heard from any adult since her world had collapsed. Dr. Hendricks prescribed prenatal vitamins and scheduled regular checkups, accepting a payment plan that fit within Rachel's tight budget. "I want you to know," Dr. Hendricks said as Rachel prepared to leave, "that being a young mother doesn't mean your life is over. It means it's different from what you planned, but different doesn't necessarily mean worse. Some of the strongest, most capable women I know had their children young and built wonderful lives despite the challenges." Walking home from the appointment, Rachel felt a strange sense of relief. The pregnancy was no longer a secret she carried alone. At least one other person knew her situation and hadn't judged her for it. Dr. Hendricks' words echoed in her mind, offering a perspective on single motherhood that focused on possibilities rather than limitations. That evening, Rachel sat in her small living room with a notepad, making lists of everything she needed to prepare for the baby's arrival. The financial calculations were daunting: cribs, car seats, diapers, clothes, childcare costs that would far exceed her current income. But breaking the overwhelming task into smaller, manageable pieces made it feel less impossible. She researched assistance programs, discovered that Tennessee offered support for pregnant women and new mothers, learned about WIC benefits and Medicaid eligibility. The social safety net she'd never thought she would need suddenly became a lifeline. Though applying for government assistance felt like another step away from the middle-class life she'd been raised to expect, Rachel's belly began to show subtle changes as she entered her second trimester. Her jeans grew tight around the waist, forcing her to invest in larger sizes that she couldn't really afford. She learned to layer clothing strategically, hiding the small but growing curve beneath loose-fitting tops and cardigan sweaters. Deception felt necessary at work, where she feared that revealing her pregnancy might cost her the job she desperately needed. Rosie had been kind and supportive, but restaurant work was physically demanding, and Rachel worried that her employer might decide she was too much of a liability once her condition became obvious. The holiday season approached with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Rachel's first Thanksgiving away from her family loomed like a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. In previous years, her mother would have been deep into preparations by now, planning menus and coordinating with extended family members who traveled from across Tennessee to gather around Elena Martinez's table. This year, Rachel would spend the holiday alone in her small apartment, trying to create new traditions from nothing. The isolation felt particularly acute during a season traditionally focused on family and gratitude, though she found herself genuinely grateful for the stability she'd managed to build from the wreckage of her former life. Dorothy Walsh, perhaps, sensing Rachel's melancholy as November progressed, began dropping hints about her own holiday plans. "I usually make far too much food for one person," she mentioned casually while they worked together to winterize her small garden. 40 years of cooking for students left me unable to scale recipes down properly." The invitation, when it finally came, was characteristically understated. "If you don't have other plans for Thanksgiving," Dorothy said, "you're welcome to join me. Nothing fancy, just traditional food and good company." Rachel accepted with gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her composure. The prospect of sharing the holiday with someone who had shown her consistent kindness felt like an unexpected gift, a reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited. That, as Thanksgiving approached, Rachel found herself reflecting on the concept of gratitude in ways she never had before. Despite the challenges and uncertainties of her situation, she had much to be thankful for: a job that provided steady income, a safe place to live, a landlady who had become a friend, medical care from a compassionate doctor, and the growing life inside her that represented hope for the future. The baby had become more real to her as the weeks passed, no longer just a crisis to be managed, but a person she was getting to know through subtle movements and changing needs. She had started reading pregnancy books, marveling at the weekly developments that were taking place inside her body, feeling a growing sense of wonder at the complexity of creating life. Rachel began talking to her unborn child more frequently, sharing her thoughts and fears and dreams during quiet moments at home. These conversations helped her process the enormous changes in her life, while building an emotional connection to the baby that made the challenges seem more worthwhile. "We're going to be okay," she would whisper, one hand resting on her expanding belly. "I don't know exactly how yet, but we're building something good here. You'll see." The words were a promise to both of them, a commitment to creating a life worth living despite the obstacles ahead. Rachel was no longer the frightened girl who had been cast out by her family 3 months ago. She was becoming someone stronger, someone capable of building happiness from unlikely circumstances. But even as her confidence grew, Rachel knew that her biggest challenges still lay ahead. The baby would arrive in spring, bringing with it financial pressures and logistical complications she could barely imagine. She would need to figure out childcare, navigate the complex world of single parenthood, and somehow provide her child with the love and stability every baby deserved. The future remained uncertain, but Rachel was learning that uncertainty didn't have to mean hopelessness. Each day brought small victories and new possibilities, building toward a life that belonged entirely to her and the child she carried. She was creating something beautiful from the ashes of her former expectations, and that knowledge gave her strength to face whatever came next. As the first snow of the season began to fall outside her apartment window, Rachel placed both hands on her growing belly and felt a flutter of movement, the baby's first greeting to the world outside. The sensation filled her with wonder and determination in equal measure. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I've been waiting to meet you." The response was another gentle flutter, as if the baby was saying hello back. In that moment, despite all the challenges and uncertainties ahead, Rachel felt truly blessed. She was no longer alone, and she never would be again. The December morning that would change everything started like any other. Rachel was 5 months pregnant now, her condition becoming increasingly difficult to hide despite her best efforts. With loose clothing and strategic layering, the winter air bit through her coat as she walked to work, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp dawn light. Millbrook was still sleeping, its streets empty except for the occasional delivery truck and the dedicated early risers who frequented Rosie's for their morning coffee ritual. Rachel had developed a comfortable routine over the past months, one that gave structure to days that might otherwise feel overwhelming. She arrived at the restaurant 30 minutes before opening, using the quiet time to prepare herself mentally for the busy breakfast rush ahead. The morning sickness had largely subsided, replaced by an energy and appetite that sometimes surprised her. Dr. Hendricks had assured her this was normal for the second trimester, and Rachel was grateful for any reprieve from the exhaustion that had characterized her early pregnancy. As she unlocked the restaurant's front door, Rachel noticed an older woman sitting on the bench across the street. This wasn't unusual. Millbrook's downtown area served as an unofficial gathering place for people waiting for buses or simply watching the world wake up. But something about this particular woman caught Rachel's attention. She sat perfectly still despite the cold, her posture suggesting someone accustomed to waiting. Her clothes clean but worn in a way that spoke of careful maintenance rather than frequent replacement. Rachel went about her opening duties, starting coffee and checking that everything was in order for Rosie's arrival. Through the large front windows, she kept glancing at the woman on the bench, noting that she hadn't moved despite the dropping temperature. By the time Rosie arrived with her usual energy and cheerful greetings, Rachel had made a decision. "There's a woman sitting outside," Rachel told her boss as they began preparing for the morning rush. "She looks cold, and she's been there for over an hour. Would it be okay if I offered her some coffee?" Rosie followed Rachel's gaze through the window, her expression softening as she observed the solitary figure. "Of course, honey. Take her a full breakfast if she wants it. Nobody should be sitting in the cold like that." Rachel poured coffee into a to-go cup and stepped outside, the bells above the door chiming softly in the morning air. Up close, the woman appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes that held a weariness Rachel recognized from her own mirror. Her clothes were clearly chosen for warmth rather than fashion. A heavy wool coat that had seen many winters, sturdy boots, and gloves with carefully mended fingertips. "Excuse me," Rachel said gently, approaching the bench with the steaming cup. "I work at the restaurant across the street, and I noticed you've been sitting here for a while. Would you like some coffee to warm up?" The woman looked up with surprise that quickly melted into gratitude. "That's very kind of you, dear," she said, accepting the cup with hands that trembled slightly from the cold. "I'm Margaret Stone. I've been waiting for the bus to Nashville, but it seems to be running late this morning." "Rachel Martinez," Rachel replied, settling beside Margaret on the bench despite the cold metal seeping through her uniform. "The Nashville bus doesn't usually run until noon on weekdays. Are you sure you have the right schedule?" Margaret's face fell as the implications of Rachel's words sank in. "Noon? But I was told it was 8 o'clock. I've been here since 6:30. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with bus schedule information. That was clearly outdated. "Oh no, this schedule is from last year, isn't it?" Rachel examined the paper, confirming her suspicions. The bus routes had been restructured several months ago, reducing service to smaller towns like Millbrook. "I'm afraid so," she said gently. "But there is a noon bus that goes to Nashville. You'd be welcome to wait inside the restaurant where it's warm." Margaret's relief was visible, though tinged with embarrassment. "I feel so foolish. I don't travel much anymore, and I should have double-checked the current schedule." She paused, studying Rachel's face with the kind of attention that suggested she was accustomed to reading people carefully. "You're very kind to help a stranger. That's not as common as it used to be." As they walked into the restaurant together, Rachel found herself curious about Margaret's story. The woman carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her obvious financial constraints, and there was something in her manner that suggested education and refinement struggling against reduced circumstances. Rosie welcomed Margaret warmly, insisting that she take a booth near the window where she could watch for her bus while staying comfortable. "Breakfast is on the house," Rosie declared in her no-nonsense way. "Nobody waits for buses on an empty stomach in my restaurant." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the kindness, though she maintained her composure with visible effort. "Thank you both. You're angels, truly." As the morning rush began, Rachel found herself checking on Margaret frequently, refilling her coffee and making sure she had everything she needed. During quieter moments, they began to talk, and Rachel learned that Margaret was traveling to Nashville to visit her daughter, who was in the hospital recovering from surgery. "Linda's my only child," Margaret explained, her worry evident despite her attempts to stay positive. "She had complications during what was supposed to be routine surgery, and she's been in intensive care for 3 days. I've been trying to get there, but transportation from Millbrook isn't easy when you don't drive anymore." Rachel felt her heart constrict with sympathy. The thought of being separated from a child during a medical crisis was almost unbearable, especially for someone who clearly had limited resources to solve the problem. "Have you been able to talk to her?" "Once, yesterday morning, but she was very weak. The nurses have been kind about updating me, but it's not the same as being there." Margaret's hands shook slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. "I keep thinking about all the times I should have visited more often, all the conversations we postponed, because we thought there would always be more time." The raw emotion in Margaret's voice struck Rachel deeply. Here was a woman facing every parent's worst nightmare, struggling with regret and helplessness in equal measure. The situation reminded Rachel painfully of her own estrangement from her family, though the circumstances were entirely different. As the morning progressed, Rachel learned more about Margaret's situation. She lived alone in a small apartment on the other side of town, surviving on Social Security and occasional income from sewing alterations. Her late husband had been a teacher, And together, they'd lived modestly but comfortably until his death 3 years ago left her struggling to manage on a fixed income. "I keep thinking I should sell the car," Margaret confided during a lull in the breakfast rush. "But Linda says I need to maintain my independence, and part of me agrees. The trouble is, my eyesight isn't what it used to be, especially at night. Or in bad weather. I haven't driven more than a few miles from home in over a year." Rachel understood the dilemma perfectly. Giving up driving would mean giving up autonomy, but continuing to drive when safety was compromised wasn't really an option either. It was the kind of impossible choice that many elderly people faced, caught between independence and safety with no good solutions. When the noon bus finally arrived, Margaret gathered her things with obvious reluctance. The prospect of the long journey to Nashville, followed by hours of uncertainty at the hospital, weighed heavily on her shoulders. Rachel walked her to the bus stop, carrying Margaret's small overnight bag and offering what encouragement she could. "Thank you for everything," Margaret said as she prepared to board. "Your kindness today means more than you know. When people are frightened and alone, small acts of caring become enormous gifts." Rachel hugged the older woman gently, careful not to put pressure on her obviously fragile frame. "I hope your daughter recovers quickly. Please take care of yourself too." As the bus pulled away, Rachel waved from the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared around the corner toward the highway. The encounter had affected her more deeply than she'd expected, stirring emotions about family and connection that she'd been trying to keep buried since her own crisis began. Back at the restaurant, Rosie noticed Rachel's subdued mood as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. "That woman really got to you, didn't she?" she observed, her tone gentle with understanding. "She reminded me of my grandmother," Rachel admitted, though that wasn't the whole truth. Margaret had reminded her of the kind of person she hoped to become, someone who maintained dignity and grace even when circumstances were difficult, someone who valued family above pride or appearances. The rest of the week passed quietly, but Rachel found herself thinking about Margaret often. She wondered how the visit to Nashville had gone, whether Linda was recovering, whether Margaret had made it home safely. The older woman's situation highlighted just how vulnerable people could become when age, health, and financial constraints converged. On Thursday, Dr. Hendricks made her usual appearance for coffee and her weekly check-in with Rachel. The doctor had become more than just a medical provider. She was one of the few people who knew about Rachel's pregnancy and offered consistent support without judgment. "You're glowing," Dr. Hendricks observed as Rachel refilled her coffee cup. "The second trimester's treating you well." "I feel better than I have in months," Rachel confirmed. "More energy, less nausea. I actually feel like I might be able to handle this whole parenting thing." Dr. Hendricks smiled, the expression warm with genuine affection. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Rachel. I see it in how you care for people here, how you've handled your situation with such maturity. That baby is lucky to have you." The words were a balm to Rachel's spirit, especially coming from someone whose opinion she respected. Dr. Hendricks had seen enough young mothers to recognize the qualities that led to success, and her confidence in Rachel's abilities helped quiet some of the doubts that still surfaced during quiet moments. "I've been thinking about childcare," Rachel mentioned, broaching a subject that had been keeping her awake at night. "I know I'll need to go back to work fairly quickly after the baby comes, but the costs are daunting." "Have you looked into the state assistance programs?" Dr. Hendricks asked. "Tennessee has support available for working mothers, including child care vouchers and sliding scale daycare options. It's not luxury care, but it's safe and reliable." Rachel nodded, though. The thought of relying on government assistance still felt foreign to her middle-class upbringing. "I've done some research. It's just hard to accept that this is my reality now." "There's no shame in accepting help when you need it," Dr. Hendricks said firmly. "Those programs exist because society recognizes that supporting young mothers ultimately benefits everyone." You're investing in your child's future and your own ability to become self-sufficient. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. The conversation continued as Dr. Hendricks shared stories of other young mothers she'd helped over the years, women who had started with nothing but determination and built successful lives for themselves and their children. The examples were encouraging, offering Rachel a vision of what might be possible with time and effort. Saturday brought an unexpected visitor to the restaurant. Margaret Stone appeared just after the lunch rush, looking healthier and more rested than she had during their first encounter. Her face lit up when she saw Rachel, and she hurried over with obvious excitement. "I had to stop by and thank you properly," Margaret said, clasping Rachel's hands warmly. "Your kindness last week meant everything to me. Linda is recovering beautifully, and I was able to spend 3 days with her before coming home." Rachel felt a surge of relief and happiness for the older woman. "I'm so glad she's better. You must have been terrified." "I was," Margaret admitted. "But having people show me such kindness when I needed it most reminded me that there's still good in the world. It gave me strength when I felt like I had none left." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I brought you something as a thank you. It's not much, but I made it myself." Inside the wrapping was a pair of hand-knitted baby booties in soft yellow yarn, clearly crafted with expert skill and careful attention to detail. Rachel gasped with surprise and delight, holding the tiny shoes up to admire the intricate pattern. "How did you know?" Rachel asked, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled knowingly. "I've raised a daughter and helped care for several grandchildren. I recognize the signs, the way you move, the glow in your complexion, the protective way you rest your hand on your stomach when you think no one is watching. Plus, my Linda is an obstetric nurse. She taught me what to look for." Rachel felt her carefully maintained privacy dissolving, but instead of fear, she experienced overwhelming relief. Margaret's discovery felt like a gift rather than an exposure. The understanding of someone who had walked a similar path decades earlier. "I'm 5 months along," Rachel confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to keep it quiet at work." "Oh, honey," Margaret said, her voice full of maternal warmth. "Are you managing all right? Do you have family support?" The question opened floodgates that Rachel hadn't realized were barely contained. Sitting in the restaurant booth with Margaret, she found herself sharing the story she'd been carrying. Alone for months, the abandonment by Kevin, the rejection by her parents, the struggle to build a life from nothing while preparing for motherhood. Margaret listened without judgment, her expressions shifting from sympathy to admiration as Rachel's story unfolded. When Rachel finished, they sat in comfortable silence for several moments, the weight of shared understanding filling the space between them. "You're remarkable," Margaret said finally. "To handle all of this on your own, at your age with such grace and determination. I'm not sure I could have done it at twice your age." "Some days I'm not sure I can do it either," Rachel admitted. "But I don't have a choice, so I just keep moving forward." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Rachel's hand. "You know, I've been rattling around in my house alone since my husband passed. 3 bedrooms, a nursery that hasn't been used in decades, and more space than one old woman needs. I've been thinking about taking in a boarder, someone who could help with the heavier chores in exchange for reduced rent." Rachel's heart began to race as she grasped the implications of Margaret's words. "Are you offering?" "I'm offering to help," Margaret said simply. "If you're interested. A young mother needs support, and an old woman needs purpose. It seems like we might be able to help each other." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that Rachel felt tears welling up despite her efforts to maintain composure. Here was the answer to prayers she hadn't even known how to pray, presented by someone who understood exactly what she was facing. "I would need to think about it," Rachel said carefully, though her heart had already accepted the offer. "I don't want to impose on your kindness." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "Kindness shared is kindness multiplied. Besides, I have selfish motives too. I miss having young people around, miss feeling useful. You'd be doing me as much of a favor as I'd be doing you." As they discussed the practical details, rent, responsibilities, living arrangements, Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since her world had collapsed 6 months ago, she wasn't facing the future alone. The baby inside her would have not just a mother, but a grandmother figure who genuinely cared about their well-being. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as their conversation drew to a close. "I want you to know that this offer comes with no conditions or expectations, beyond basic respect and consideration. Your baby will be welcomed and loved, regardless of the circumstances of their conception. Every child deserves that." Rachel couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She nodded, tears flowing freely now, grateful beyond words for this unexpected angel who had appeared at exactly the right moment. As Margaret prepared to leave, she pressed a piece of paper into Rachel's hand with her address and phone number. "Come by this weekend and see the house. We'll figure out the details together." Walking home that evening, Rachel felt lighter than she had in months. The baby booties were tucked safely in her purse, a tangible reminder that her child would be born into a world where kindness still existed, where strangers could become family, where hope could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The future suddenly looked brighter than it had since that terrible night when her father's words had shattered her world. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning to thrive. The Victorian-style house on Maple Street stood like a testament to an earlier era, its wraparound porch and gabled windows speaking of times when families gathered for Sunday dinners, and children played safely in neighborhood streets. Rachel stood at the white picket gate Saturday morning, her hand resting on the latch as she tried to calm the nervous excitement fluttering in her chest. Margaret's offer had seemed almost too good to be true during their emotional conversation at the restaurant, and now she was here to see if reality matched the hope that had been building inside her. For 3 days, Margaret appeared on the front porch before Rachel could knock, her face brightening with genuine pleasure at seeing her unexpected young friend. She wore a lavender cardigan over a simple dress, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight as she hurried down the steps with more energy than her age might suggest. "Rachel, dear, I'm so glad you came," Margaret said, embracing her warmly. "I've been thinking about our conversation all week, and I'm more convinced than ever that this arrangement could be wonderful for both of us." The interior of the house was a perfect reflection of Margaret's personality, clean and well-maintained despite its obvious age, filled with comfortable furniture that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than fashion trends. Family photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, showing decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays celebrated within these walls. "This was my husband Robert's family home," Margaret explained as she led Rachel through the living room. "We moved here when Linda was 5, and she grew up running through these rooms. The house has been in the Stone family for 60 years, and it's seen its share of joy and sorrow." Rachel ran her fingers along the polished banister as they climbed the stairs, imagining all the hands that had touched the same wood over the decades. The house felt solid and permanent in a way that her temporary living situations never had, promising the kind of stability she desperately wanted to provide. For her child, the second floor contained 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with original fixtures that had been carefully maintained. Margaret opened the door to the largest bedroom, revealing a space that was clearly prepared for a new occupant. Fresh linens covered the double bed. Empty dresser drawers had been cleaned and lined with paper, and the windows sparkled with recent washing. "This would be your room," Margaret said, stepping aside to let Rachel explore. "It has the best morning light in the house, and it's far enough from my room that we'd each have privacy while still being close enough to help each other when needed." Rachel walked to the window, looking out over the backyard where ancient Oak trees provided shade for a small garden plot that showed signs of careful tending. She could envision herself living here, could imagine her child taking first steps on these hardwood floors and learning to read in the window seat that overlooked the quiet street. "Margaret, this is beautiful," Rachel said, turning back to find the older woman watching her with hopeful eyes. "But I need to be honest about my situation. I can't pay much rent, and once the baby comes, there will be crying at night and all the chaos that comes with an infant. Are you sure you understand what you're offering?" Margaret's smile was gentle but firm. "My dear, I raised a daughter in this house. I know exactly what babies require, and I'm looking forward to it. As for rent, we'll work out something fair based on what you can afford. Money isn't my primary concern. Companionship and purpose are worth more to me than market rates." They moved to the room next door, which Margaret explained had been Linda's childhood bedroom. Now it stood empty except for built-in bookshelves and a rocking chair positioned near the window. "I thought this might work as a nursery," Margaret said. "It's right next to your room, and the morning sun would be perfect for a baby." Rachel stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer and the thought of her child having a real nursery instead of a corner of a studio apartment. The room felt like a promise of the kind of childhood she wanted to provide, safe, warm, and filled with love from multiple generations. "There's something else I want to show you," Margaret said, leading Rachel to the third floor. What had once been an attic had been converted into a bright studio space with skylights and windows on all sides. Easels stood at various angles. Canvases in different stages of completion covered the walls, and the smell of oil paints and turpentine created an atmosphere of creative energy. "This is where I paint," Margaret explained, her voice taking on a note of pride. "I never had time for art when Linda was young and Robert was working, but after retirement, I discovered I had some talent for it. I sell pieces occasionally at local galleries, nothing fancy, but it brings in a little extra income." Rachel examined the paintings with growing amazement. Margaret's work showed real skill: landscapes of the Tennessee hills, portraits of local people, still lifes that captured everyday objects with remarkable sensitivity. These weren't the hobby paintings of someone passing time. They were the work of an artist who had found her calling later in life. "These are incredible," Rachel said, stopping before a painting of children playing in a summer meadow. "You're really talented, Margaret. Why didn't you pursue this earlier?" Margaret's laugh held a note of wistfulness. "Different generation, different expectations. Women of my era were supposed to be wives and mothers first, everything else second. Not that I regret raising Linda or supporting Robert's career, but I sometimes wonder what might have been if I'd had the confidence to pursue art when I was younger." The comment sparked something in Rachel's mind, a recognition of how women's dreams often got deferred or abandoned entirely in the face of family responsibilities. Here was Margaret, finally pursuing her passion in her 60s, creating beautiful work despite decades of delay. It was both inspiring and sobering. They returned to the kitchen, where Margaret prepared tea while explaining the practical aspects of the living arrangement. The house had a small apartment-style setup in the basement that could provide additional income if needed, laundry facilities that would be shared, and a garden where they could grow vegetables to supplement their grocery budgets. "I've been thinking about childcare too," Margaret said as she poured steaming water over tea bags. "When you're ready to return to work after the baby comes, I could provide care during the day. I know it's not the same as a professional daycare center, but I raised Linda successfully, and I understand child development." The offer was so perfectly suited to Rachel's needs that she felt overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to her. Margaret was essentially offering to become a grandmother to her child, providing not just housing but the kind of multi-generational support that had become rare in modern families. "Why are you doing this for me?" Rachel asked, her voice thick with emotion. "We barely know each other, and you're offering to completely change your life to help someone who's practically a stranger." Margaret was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully as she considered her response. "Do you know what the hardest part of getting older is?" she finally asked. "It's not the physical limitations or the health concerns. It's the gradual realization that you're becoming invisible, that the world has moved on and no longer needs what you have to offer." She set down her spoon and looked directly at Rachel. "When Linda moved to Nashville, this house became a museum of my past rather than a home for my present. I was just existing here, maintaining routines that no longer had much meaning. Your situation reminded me that I still have something valuable to contribute, experience, wisdom, love that has nowhere to go." Rachel felt tears welling up as Margaret's honesty touched something deep inside her. Here was a woman who understood loneliness, who recognized the way life could isolate people despite their need for connection and purpose. "Plus," Margaret continued with a slight smile, "I've always believed that kindness is like compound interest. The more you invest, the greater the returns, sometimes in ways you never expected. Helping you feels like the right thing to do, not just for you but for me." They spent the rest of the morning discussing practical details: when Rachel might move in, how to handle utilities and household expenses, what furniture and belongings Margaret had in storage that might be useful for a new mother. Every conversation reinforced Rachel's sense that this arrangement could work beautifully for both of them. As they talked, Rachel found herself sharing more about her background, her relationship with her parents, and her fears about single motherhood. Margaret listened with the kind of attention that suggested she genuinely cared about the answers, asking thoughtful questions that helped Rachel clarify her own thoughts and feelings. "You know," Margaret said during a lull in their conversation, "I've been estranged from family members myself. My sister and I didn't speak for 15 years over a disagreement that seems petty in hindsight. Pride can be a terrible thing when it prevents us from repairing relationships that matter. Do you think I should try to contact my parents?" Rachel asked, the question that had been haunting her for months finally spoken aloud. Margaret considered carefully before responding. "I think you should do what feels right for you and your baby. Sometimes people need time to process their mistakes before they can admit them. Sometimes they never do. But you can't control their choices, only your own." The wisdom in Margaret's words resonated deeply with Rachel. She had been carrying guilt about the estrangement, wondering if she should have tried harder to make peace with her family. Margaret's perspective helped her understand that some relationships require mutual effort to repair, and she couldn't force forgiveness from people who weren't ready to give it. By early afternoon, they had worked out the basic terms of their arrangement. Rachel would move in at the end of January, giving her time to finish her current lease with Dorothy Walsh and save money for the transition. She would pay nominal rent, plus help with household maintenance and gardening. Margaret would provide childcare support once the baby arrived, and they would share cooking duties and household expenses. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as Rachel prepared to leave. "I want you to feel free to have friends visit, to live your life as a young woman should. This isn't a boarding house with strict rules. It's a home where two women are choosing to support each other." Rachel hugged Margaret goodbye, feeling as though she was embracing not just a new living situation, but a new chapter of her life. The walk back to her current apartment felt different somehow, as though the future had shifted from uncertain to hopeful in the space of a single morning. That evening, Rachel called Dr. Hendricks to share the news about her housing situation. The doctor was delighted, understanding immediately how important stability would be for both Rachel's pregnancy and her transition to motherhood. "Margaret Stone is well known in our community," Dr. Hendricks said. "She's helped with church nurseries for years, and I've watched her care for her grandchildren during visits. You couldn't ask for a better support system during this crucial time." The validation from someone Rachel trusted reinforced her confidence in the decision. Over the following weeks, as she gave notice to Dorothy Walsh and began planning her move, Rachel felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced since before her world had collapsed. Dorothy took the news of Rachel's departure with grace, expressing genuine happiness that her young tenant had found such a wonderful opportunity. "You've grown so much stronger since you first knocked on my door," Dorothy observed as they shared tea one evening. "Margaret Stone is getting a remarkable young woman as a housemate." The transition period allowed Rachel to process how dramatically her life had changed in just 7 months. The frightened, abandoned girl who had fled her family home had been replaced by a confident young woman who was building meaningful relationships and making thoughtful decisions about her future. Pregnancy was progressing beautifully, with regular checkups confirming that the baby was developing normally. Rachel had begun to feel strong, regular movements that reminded her constantly of the new life she was nurturing. The baby seemed most active in the evenings, often responding to music or the sound of Rachel's voice with enthusiastic kicks and turns. "You're going to love your new home," Rachel would whisper during these quiet moments, her hands tracing the increasingly prominent curve of her belly. "Margaret is going to spoil you completely, and you'll have a real nursery with morning sunlight and space to grow." The baby's response was always immediate, a flutter of movement that felt like agreement, like anticipation for the life they would build together in the old Victorian house on Maple Street. As January drew to a close, Rachel packed her few belongings with a sense of excitement rather than the desperate urgency that had characterized her previous moves. She was no longer running from something. She was moving toward a future that held promise and possibility. The morning of the move, Margaret appeared at Rachel's apartment with a borrowed pickup truck and 2 strong young men from her church, who had volunteered to help with the heavier items. The efficiency of the operation spoke to Margaret's organizational skills and her network of community connections. "Welcome home, dear," Margaret said as they carried the last box into the Victorian house. "I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something wonderful for both of us." Rachel stood in the living room that was now her home, surrounded by the warmth of old wood and family history, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. The baby inside her seemed to sense the significance of the moment, offering a gentle kick that felt like approval. She was no longer alone, no longer fighting to survive on the margins of other people's lives. She had found family in the most unexpected place, and together, she and Margaret would create something beautiful from the pieces of their separate stories. The future stretched ahead, full of unknowns but no longer frightening. Whatever challenges awaited, Rachel knew she would face them with the support of someone who truly cared about her well-being and the child she carried. As evening settled over Maple Street, Rachel sat in the rocking chair that would soon cradle her baby, watching Margaret tend to dinner preparations in the kitchen below. This was what home felt like, not a place defined by blood relationships or legal documents, but a space filled with love freely given and gratefully received. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if celebrating their new beginning. Rachel smiled, placing both hands on her belly as she whispered, "We made it, little one. We're finally home." February arrived with an unexpected warmth that fooled the daffodils into blooming early in Margaret's carefully tended garden. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, watching her housemate deadhead the winter roses with practiced efficiency, marveling at how naturally they had fallen into domestic rhythms that felt like they'd been living together for years rather than weeks. At 7 months pregnant, Rachel's movements had become more deliberate, her body adapting to carry the weight of new life while her mind adapted to the reality of impending motherhood. The morning routine they had developed worked seamlessly around both women's needs. Margaret was an early riser who enjoyed preparing breakfast while listening to classical music on the old radio that had belonged to her late husband. Rachel, whose energy levels fluctuated with the demands of pregnancy, appreciated having coffee and toast waiting when she emerged from her room, ready to face another day at Rosie's restaurant. The roses are responding beautifully to this mild weather," Margaret called through the open window, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who understood the subtle negotiations required for successful gardening. "We should have a spectacular spring display this year." Rachel smiled, noting how Margaret's use of "we" had become natural and inclusive. The older woman had a gift for making her feel like a valued partner in household decisions, rather than a temporary guest. From choosing paint colors for the nursery to planning meals that accommodated Rachel's changing appetite, Margaret approached their shared life with enthusiasm and respect. The nursery project had become Margaret's particular passion. Together, they had transformed Linda's former bedroom into a space that felt both modern and timeless. Margaret's artistic eye proved invaluable in selecting colors and arranging furniture, while Rachel contributed practical considerations about feeding schedules and diaper changes. The result was a room that felt ready to welcome new life. Soft yellow walls, white furniture that would grow with the child, and hand-painted border featuring the morning glories that reminded Margaret of hope renewed each day. "I found something wonderful at the estate sale yesterday," Margaret announced, entering the kitchen with dirt-stained gloves and excitement in her voice. "A vintage high chair that just needs a little restoration work. The craftsmanship is exceptional, solid wood construction that will last for generations." Rachel had learned to appreciate Margaret's eye for quality pieces that could be restored rather than buying everything new. The older woman's Depression-era sensibilities meant she understood how to stretch resources while still creating beauty. Skills that proved invaluable for a young mother on a tight budget. Their financial arrangement had evolved organically over the past month. Rachel contributed what she could from her restaurant wages, while Margaret's Social Security and occasional art sales covered the major household expenses. They shared grocery costs and cooking duties, creating a system that felt equitable despite their different circumstances. More importantly, they had developed emotional bonds that transcended mere economic convenience. Margaret had begun sharing stories of her early motherhood experiences, tales of Linda's childhood that revealed both the joys and challenges of raising a child in simpler times. These conversations helped Rachel understand that every generation of mothers faced uncertainty, that the fears she was experiencing were universal rather than unique to her situation. "I remember feeling completely unprepared when Linda was born," Margaret confided one evening as they organized baby clothes donated by church members. "The nurses at the hospital assumed I knew what I was doing because I was married and seemed confident, but inside I was terrified. Nobody tells you how overwhelming it feels to be completely responsible for another human being." These honest revelations about the difficulties of motherhood balanced Margaret's more encouraging observations, creating a realistic picture of what Rachel could expect. Unlike the idealized versions of parenting often presented in books and movies, Margaret's stories acknowledge the exhaustion, confusion, and occasional frustration that accompanied the profound love of caring for children. Dr. Hendricks continued her regular visits to the restaurant, now serving as both medical advisor and friend. She had expressed delight at Rachel's living situation, understanding how crucial emotional support would be during the transition to motherhood. The doctor's professional experience combined with Margaret's practical wisdom created a support network that addressed both medical and emotional needs. "Your blood pressure is excellent, and the baby's movements are strong and regular," Dr. Hendricks reported during Rachel's most recent appointment. "Everything suggests you're going to have a smooth delivery and a healthy child. Margaret's support is clearly benefiting both of you." The validation from someone whose medical opinion Rachel trusted reinforced her confidence in the choices she had made. The contrast between her current situation and the isolation she had faced just months earlier was dramatic. She now had people who cared about her well-being and were actively invested in her success as a mother. Work at Rosie's had become more challenging as Rachel's pregnancy advanced, but her employer had proven surprisingly accommodating. Rosie understood the realities of working while pregnant and had adjusted Rachel's responsibilities to minimize physical strain while maintaining her income. The breakfast shift suited Rachel's energy patterns, and the regular customers had become protective of her well-being. "You need to sit down more often," advised Mrs. Patterson, a retired nurse who frequented the restaurant. "Swollen ankles are nothing to ignore in your condition." Such unsolicited advice had initially irritated Rachel, but she had come to appreciate the community's concern for her welfare, recognizing it as evidence that she belonged somewhere again. The question of her estranged family remained a source of occasional sadness, particularly as the baby's due date approached. Rachel wondered if her parents thought about their first grandchild, whether they experienced any regret about their harsh ultimatum. Margaret had gently suggested that becoming grandparents sometimes soften people's hearts, but Rachel couldn't risk the emotional devastation of another rejection. "Some wounds take time to heal," Margaret observed during one of their evening conversations. "Your parents may come around eventually, but you can't build your life around that possibility. You have to create happiness with the people who choose to love you now." The wisdom in Margaret's words helped Rachel focus on the family she was building rather than mourning the one she had lost. The baby inside her would grow up knowing unconditional love from both mother and chosen grandmother, perhaps never fully understanding what they had been spared by not experiencing conditional family acceptance. March brought the first serious preparation for labor and delivery. Rachel enrolled in childbirth classes at the community center, where Margaret accompanied her as birthing partner and emotional support. The classes covered everything from breathing techniques to newborn care, but Rachel found the social aspect equally valuable, connecting with other expectant parents and sharing experiences with women facing similar challenges. "You're fortunate to have such dedicated support," commented the instructor, noting how attentively Margaret participated in the exercises and asked informed questions. Many first-time mothers don't have anyone with childcare experience to guide them. Margaret's presence at these classes reinforced Rachel's sense that she wasn't facing motherhood alone. The older woman's enthusiasm for learning current techniques while sharing wisdom from her own parenting experience created a bridge between generations that benefited everyone in the group. The baby shower, organized by Margaret and the ladies from her church circle, exceeded anything Rachel had imagined possible. Women who barely knew her contributed handmade gifts, practical items, and advice born from decades of collective mothering experience. The generosity overwhelmed Rachel, who had expected to acquire baby necessities gradually as finances permitted. "This is what community means," explained Mrs. Foster, the church organist who had contributed a beautiful hand-quilted blanket. "We support each other through life's transitions because we understand that today's recipient might be tomorrow's provider. You'll have your chance to help other young mothers someday." The shower gifts addressed nearly every need Rachel had identified for the baby's first months: clothes, diapers, feeding supplies, toys, and the countless small items that new parents discovered they couldn't live without. More importantly, the event demonstrated that she had been accepted into a network of women who would provide ongoing support as she navigated early motherhood. Dr. Hendricks attended the shower, bringing both a professional perspective and a beautiful silver picture frame engraved with the baby's due date. "This child is going to be surrounded by love from the moment they arrive," she observed, watching Rachel open gifts with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. The doctor's prediction proved accurate in ways that extended beyond material support. Margaret had begun preparing for the baby's arrival with the thoroughness of someone who understood both the immediate needs and long-term requirements of child rearing. She researched current safety standards for infant equipment, updated her knowledge of feeding schedules and sleep patterns, and created systems for managing household routines around a newborn's unpredictable demands. "I want to be helpful without being intrusive," Margaret explained as she organized supplies in the nursery. New mothers need support, but they also need space to develop confidence in their own abilities. My role is to assist, not to take over. This balanced approach reassured Rachel, who worried about maintaining her independence while accepting help. Margaret's respect for her autonomy as a mother, combined with practical support, created an ideal environment for learning parenting skills without pressure or judgment. As April approached and Rachel's due date drew near, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened teenager who had been cast out by her family had transformed into a confident young woman preparing to become a mother. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward, but it had taught her that strength could be found in unexpected places and that love came in many forms. I keep thinking about how different everything might have been if I hadn't met you, Rachel confided to Margaret one evening as they assembled the crib that would soon hold her baby. I was so lost and scared, and you appeared exactly when I needed help most. Margaret's response was characteristically modest. We helped each other, dear. I needed purpose and companionship as much as you needed support and housing. Sometimes the best relationships are born from mutual need rather than convenience. The observation captured something essential about their connection. Neither woman had been looking for the relationship they found, but both had been open to the possibility of unexpected friendship. Their different ages and backgrounds had proven complementary rather than divisive, creating a household that functioned harmoniously despite unconventional circumstances. Rachel's final weeks of pregnancy brought the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that characterized this transitional period for all expectant mothers. Her body felt increasingly cumbersome, sleep became elusive, and the reality of imminent labor sparked both excitement and apprehension. Margaret's calm presence provided stability during moments when emotions threatened to overwhelm practical considerations. Labor is intense but manageable, Margaret reassured her during one of Rachel's more anxious moments. Your body knows what to do, and you have excellent medical care. Most importantly, you have people who love you ready to support you through whatever comes. The reminder of her support network helped Rachel maintain perspective during the final countdown to motherhood. Unlike many women facing their first delivery, she wouldn't be alone or uncertain about postpartum care. Margaret had already arranged her schedule to provide round-the-clock assistance during the first weeks, understanding that new mothers needed both practical help and emotional encouragement. Dr. Hendricks had scheduled weekly appointments for the final month, monitoring both Rachel's health and the baby's continued development. Each visit confirmed that everything was progressing normally, that both mother and child were preparing successfully for the transition from pregnancy to parenthood. You're in excellent shape for delivery, Dr. Hendricks announced after Rachel's 38-week appointment. The baby is in perfect position, your cervix is beginning to soften, and all indicators suggest you'll have a straightforward labor. Margaret's support has clearly benefited your stress levels and overall health. The medical validation of their unconventional living arrangement pleased both women, confirming that their chosen family structure was providing genuine benefits for everyone involved. Rachel's pregnancy had been healthier and less stressful because of Margaret's presence, while Margaret had found renewed purpose in preparing for her honorary grandmother role. As Rachel entered her final week of pregnancy, the house on Maple Street felt charged with anticipation. Baby clothes were washed and folded, the hospital bag was packed and ready by the front door, and Margaret had prepared meals that could be quickly reheated during the chaotic early days of newborn care. Everything possible had been done to smooth the transition from pregnancy to parenthood. This time next week, there might be 3 of us living here, Rachel mused as she and Margaret shared what might be their last quiet dinner alone together. Are you ready for that level of disruption to your peaceful household? Margaret's smile was radiant with anticipation. My dear, I've been ready for months. This house has been far too quiet for far too long. I can't wait to hear a baby's cry echoing through these rooms again. The enthusiasm in Margaret's voice reassured Rachel that their living arrangement would adapt successfully to include a newborn. The older woman's excitement about becoming an honorary grandmother matched Rachel's own anticipation about becoming a mother, creating a household unified in welcoming new life. That night, Rachel lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around her creaking floorboards, the whisper of wind through ancient oak trees, the distant sound of Margaret's radio playing soft music as she worked on her latest painting. These sounds had become the soundtrack of home, the audio backdrop for the most transformative period of her young life. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby's movements that had become so familiar over the past months. Soon, very soon, she would hold this child in her arms and begin the most important relationship of her life. The thought filled her with wonder and determination in equal measure. "We're ready for you, little one," she whispered into the darkness. "We've prepared a place full of love and people who can't wait to meet you. Your chosen grandmother is going to spoil you completely, and I'm going to love you more than you'll ever know." The baby responded with a gentle kick, as if acknowledging the promise and approving of the arrangements that had been made. In just days, the final chapter of this pregnancy journey would begin, leading to the first chapter of an entirely new Story 1, featuring a mother, her child, and the remarkable woman who had chosen to help raise them both. The future stretched ahead, no longer uncertain but filled with promise. Rachel had built something beautiful from the ashes of her former life, creating a family bound not by blood, but by choice, love, and mutual commitment to each other's well-being. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them supported by people who truly cared about her success. As sleep finally claimed her, Rachel's dreams were filled with images of the life she was about to begin: a baby's first smile, Margaret teaching a toddler to paint, family dinners around the old kitchen table, birthday parties in the backyard where daffodils bloomed each spring. The vision was so vivid, so full of love and laughter, that she woke with tears of joy on her cheeks. The greatest adventure of her life was about to begin, and she had never felt more ready. The first contraction struck Rachel at 3:15 on a Tuesday morning, pulling her from deep sleep with an intensity that left no doubt about what was happening. She lay still for several moments, breathing through the sensation while her mind shifted from drowsy confusion to sharp awareness. After 9 months of carrying this baby, the moment she had both anticipated and feared had finally arrived. Margaret appeared in the doorway before Rachel could call for her, somehow sensing the change in the household's rhythm despite the early hour. The older woman moved with practiced efficiency, her calm presence immediately steadying Rachel's nerves as another contraction built and peaked. "How long between them?" Margaret asked, settling into the bedside chair they had positioned there weeks ago in preparation for this moment. "This is only the second one," Rachel replied, glancing at the clock. "About 8 minutes apart, I think." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Early labor then. We have time to get you comfortable and contact Dr. Hendricks. Remember what we learned in class: conserve your energy for the work ahead." The next few hours passed in a careful dance of timing contractions, light movement around the house, and phone calls to coordinate with the medical team. Dr. Hendricks confirmed that Rachel should head to the hospital once contractions were consistently 5 minutes apart, advising patients during these preliminary stages. "First babies often take their time," the doctor explained during their check-in call. "Use this early period to rest and stay hydrated. Margaret knows what to watch for. Trust her instincts along with your own." By mid-morning, the contractions had intensified and shortened to 6 minutes apart. Rachel found that walking helped manage the discomfort, so she and Margaret moved slowly through the house, pausing during peaks to breathe through each wave. The familiar surroundings provided comfort during this transition, allowing Rachel to labor in the place that had become her sanctuary. "I keep thinking about my mother," Rachel confided as they paused in the nursery doorway, her hand resting on her belly between contractions. She went through this with me, and I wonder if she's thinking about her grandchild being born today. Margaret's expression was gentle with understanding. Mothers never stop loving their children, even when pride or circumstances create distance. She may not be here physically, but I believe she's thinking of you. The conversation was interrupted by another contraction, stronger than before, that required Rachel's full attention. When it passed, Margaret suggested they gather the hospital bags and prepare for departure. The active labor phase was approaching, and Dr. Hendricks preferred her patients to arrive at the hospital with adequate time for assessment and preparation. Thought the drive to Millbrook General Hospital took 15 minutes, with Margaret providing steady encouragement while navigating traffic that seemed unusually heavy for a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel concentrated on the breathing techniques they had practiced, finding that focusing on Margaret's voice helped her stay centered during contractions. "You're doing beautifully," Margaret murmured as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. "Soon you'll be holding your baby, and all of this intensity will transform into the most amazing joy you've ever experienced." The hospital admission process moved smoothly, with Dr. Hendricks arriving within minutes of their registration. The examination confirmed what Rachel already knew: active labor was progressing normally, and their baby would likely arrive before evening. The medical staff welcomed Margaret as Rachel's primary support person, understanding that chosen family often provided more effective comfort than traditional arrangements. "Your cervix is dilating well, and the baby's heartbeat is strong and regular," Dr. Hendricks reported after the initial assessment. "Everything suggests you're going to have a straightforward delivery. The next few hours will be intense, but remember that every contraction brings you closer to meeting your child." Labor progressed steadily through the afternoon, with contractions growing stronger and more frequent as Rachel's body prepared for delivery. Margaret never left her side, providing constant encouragement, helping with position changes, and serving as advocate with the medical staff when Rachel was too focused on labor to communicate clearly. "I can't do this," Rachel gasped during a particularly intense contraction as evening approached. "It's too much, Margaret. I'm not strong enough." "You are absolutely strong enough," Margaret replied firmly, taking Rachel's hands in hers. "You've already proven your strength by building a life for this baby under impossible circumstances. This is just the final step in bringing your child safely into the world." Dr. Hendricks appeared for another examination, her face brightening with excitement at what she discovered. "Rachel, you're completely dilated. It's time to start pushing. Your baby is ready to be born." The delivery room filled with focused energy as nurses prepared equipment, and Dr. Hendricks positioned herself to guide the final stage of labor. Margaret moved to Rachel's head, providing both physical support and emotional encouragement as the pushing stage began. "Look at me, honey," Margaret instructed during the first push. "Channel all that strength you've shown over the past year. This baby needs you to bring them safely into the world." The next hour tested every reserve of strength Rachel possessed. But with each push, she felt closer to the moment that would transform her from expectant mother to parent. Margaret's steady presence anchored her through the intensity, while Dr. Hendricks provided expert guidance through each stage of delivery. "I can see the head," Dr. Hendricks announced with excitement. "One more strong push, Rachel. Your baby is almost here." With a final surge of effort that seemed to draw on strength from depths Rachel hadn't known existed, she felt the sensation of her child emerging into the world. The delivery room filled with the sound of a baby's first cry, strong, indignant, and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Dr. Hendricks announced, lifting the tiny, slippery form for Rachel to see. "A beautiful, healthy daughter." Rachel reached for her baby with trembling arms, hardly believing that the pregnancy journey was over and motherhood had begun. The tiny girl was red and wrinkled, her dark hair matted against her head, her eyes squeezed shut as she protested. This sudden change in environment, she was absolutely perfect. "Hello, sweetheart," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter for the first time. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Margaret stood beside them. Her own eyes filled with tears of joy as she watched Rachel meet her child. "She's beautiful, Rachel, absolutely beautiful. Look at those perfect little fingers." The next hour passed in a blur of medical procedures, newborn assessments, and the overwhelming emotion of becoming a family. The baby girl weighed 6 pounds, 8 ounces, measured 19 inches long, and scored perfectly on all the standard health evaluations. Dr. Hendricks pronounced both mother and daughter in excellent condition, with no complications from the delivery. "What will you name her?" asked the nurse who was completing the birth certificate paperwork. Rachel looked down at her daughter, who had settled into peaceful sleep against her chest. Over the past months, she had considered many names, but now, holding this perfect child, only one felt right. "Hope," Rachel said softly. "Hope Margaret Martinez." Margaret gasped with surprise and emotion at hearing her own name included. "Rachel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Rachel interrupted gently. "You helped bring her into this world, and you're going to help raise her. She should carry the name of the woman who saved us both." The paperwork was completed with Hope's full name officially recorded, making permanent the bond between they. 3 generations now represented in the hospital room. Margaret held her namesake while Rachel rested, marveling at the tiny features and perfect miniature hands that gripped her finger with surprising strength. "She's going to grow up knowing she was wanted and loved from the very beginning," Margaret murmured to the sleeping baby. "She'll never doubt that she belongs exactly where she is." The first feeding went smoothly, with Hope latching naturally, and nursing with the instinctive skill that amazed new mothers. Rachel watched her daughter's face during these quiet moments, memorizing every detail and marveling at the instant, overwhelming love she felt for this tiny person who had been part of her for so long. Dr. Hendricks made her final rounds that evening, pronouncing both patients ready for discharge the following morning. "You've done beautifully, Rachel. Hope is lucky to have such a strong, determined mother. And Margaret, your support has been invaluable throughout this entire process." That night, as Rachel dozed fitfully in the hospital bed with Hope sleeping in the bassinet beside her, Margaret maintained a quiet vigil in the bedside chair. The older woman watched over both mother and child with protective tenderness, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected family that had transformed her lonely existence into purposeful joy. The ride home from the hospital felt surreal, with Hope secured in the car seat that had been waiting for months in Margaret's vehicle. The spring morning was bright with promise, daffodils blooming in yards they passed, trees beginning to show the tender green of new leaves. Everything seemed more vivid and meaningful now that Hope was part of their world. The house on Maple Street welcomed them with flowers from Margaret's garden arranged throughout the rooms and a nursery that was perfectly prepared for its new occupant. Rachel carried Hope through each room, introducing her daughter to the home where she would grow up surrounded by love and stability. "This is your nursery," Rachel explained to the alert baby who seemed to be taking in her surroundings with serious consideration. "Margaret painted those morning glories on the wall especially for you. And this is the rocking chair where we'll read stories together." The first weeks of Hope's life established rhythms that worked for all 3 residents of the house. Margaret proved invaluable during the challenging adjustment period, taking night feedings so Rachel could rest, preparing meals that accommodated breastfeeding nutrition needs, and providing the calm wisdom that helped new mothers navigate unexpected challenges. "Every baby is different," Margaret observed during one of Hope's fussy periods. "Some are natural sleepers. Others prefer to be held constantly. Hope seems to like routine and gentle stimulation. She's already showing signs of being a thoughtful personality." Rachel marveled at Margaret's ability to read Hope's cues and provide solutions for minor problems that seemed overwhelming to inexperienced eyes. The older woman's confidence in handling newborn care allowed Rachel to develop her own Maternal instincts without panic or second-guessing every decision. The community response to Hope's arrival exceeded anything Rachel had anticipated. Church. Members brought meals and offered babysitting assistance. Rosie Chun visited with a beautiful handmade blanket and promises that Rachel's job would be waiting when she was ready to return. Dr. Hendricks made house calls during the first week, ensuring that both mother and baby were thriving in their home environment. This is what it takes to raise a child successfully, Dr. Hendricks observed during one of these visits. Not just loving parents, but a community that invests in children's well-being. Hope is growing up with advantages that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with human connection. As Hope grew from newborn to infant, her personality began emerging in ways that delighted both Rachel and Margaret. She was an alert, curious baby who seemed fascinated by faces and voices, responding to Margaret's stories and Rachel's lullabies with focused attention that suggested intelligence and engagement with her environment. "She's going to be a reader," Margaret predicted, watching 3-month-old Hope study the pictures in board books with intense concentration. "Look how she follows the illustrations and turns toward your voice when you read. Some children are born with that literary spark." The prediction proved accurate as Hope continued developing. She reached every milestone on schedule, her bright eyes taking in everything around her with obvious intelligence. By 6 months, she was sitting independently and showing preferences for certain toys and activities that revealed an emerging personality. Rachel had returned to work at Rosie's part-time when Hope was 3 months old, with Margaret providing childcare during her shifts. The arrangement worked perfectly for everyone involved. Rachel maintained her income and adult interaction. Margaret enjoyed caring for Hope, and the baby thrived with consistent, loving attention. "I don't know how single mothers manage without support like this," Rachel confided to Dr. Hendricks during Hope's 6-month checkup. "Margaret has made everything possible, not just the practical help, but the emotional support of knowing Hope is loved by more than just me." As Hope's first birthday approached, Rachel reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. The frightened 18-year-old who had been cast out by her family had become a confident mother raising a thriving child. With the help of chosen family who loved them both unconditionally, Margaret had commissioned a local photographer to create a family portrait, featuring all 3 generations represented in their household. The resulting image captured Hope's bright smile, Rachel's maternal confidence, and Margaret's joy in her honorary grandmother role. It would hang in the living room alongside Margaret's own family photos, officially documenting their unconventional but deeply loving family unit. Hope's first birthday party filled the backyard with friends from church, neighbors who had watched her grow, and co-workers from Rosie's who had become extended family. The celebration featured Margaret's homemade cake, decorations in Hope's favorite colors, and enough gifts to stock a toy store. Most importantly, it demonstrated the community that had formed around this little girl, who had been born into such unusual but loving circumstances. "Make a wish for Hope," Margaret suggested as they prepared to blow out the single candle on the birthday cake. Rachel looked around at the faces surrounding them, people who had chosen to love and support her daughter, despite having no obligation to do so. Her wish was simple, that Hope would always know she was wanted, cherished, and surrounded by people who celebrated her existence. As the sun set on Hope's first birthday, Rachel stood in the nursery watching her daughter sleep peacefully in the crib that Margaret had so carefully restored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but tonight was perfect, a moment of complete contentment in the life she had built from nothing. "Thank you," Rachel whispered to Margaret, who had appeared in the doorway to check on both mother and child, "for everything. For saving us both when we needed it most." Margaret's smile was radiant with satisfaction and love. "Thank you for letting me be part of your story. Hope has given my life purpose and meaning I thought I'd lost forever. We've all saved each other." The old house settled around them with familiar creaking sounds. sheltering 3 generations of women who had found each other when they needed family most. Hope would grow up knowing that love came in many forms, that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that kindness had the power to transform lives in the most unexpected ways. Outside, morning glories climbed the porch posts, opening fresh blooms each day in an endless cycle of renewal and hope. Just like the family inside, they proved that beautiful things could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, creating joy where once there had been only emptiness. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and anchored by love that had been freely given and gratefully received. Rachel's story had begun with loss and rejection, but it had become something far more beautiful, a testament to the power of human kindness and the strength that emerged when people chose to care for each other without condition or reservation. Hope stirred in her sleep, smiling at whatever dreams filled her young mind. She was growing up in a world where she was treasured, where her existence brought joy to everyone around her, where the phrase, "I'll help raise that baby too," had been more than just words. It had been a promise kept with love, dedication, and the kind of grace that transformed ordinary lives into extraordinary stories. 2 years later, Rachel received an unexpected phone call. Elena Martinez's voice was barely recognizable when she called Rosie's restaurant. "Rachel? Mia, is that really you?" The words carried years of suppressed longing. "Mama, how did you find me?" Rachel stepped outside, her hands trembling. "I never stopped looking," Elena whispered. "Your father passed away 3 months ago. Cancer. At the end, all he talked about was his granddaughter he'd never met." The news hit Rachel hard. Miguel Martinez was gone forever, along with any chance of reconciliation. Elena continued. "He kept newspaper clippings. Someone from the church recognized you in Hope's birth announcement. He carried that article in his wallet." Margaret appeared beside Rachel, offering silent support as Elena spoke. "I want to meet her. My granddaughter. I want to apologize and try to rebuild what pride destroyed." After much consideration and Margaret's wise counsel, Rachel agreed to meet Elena at a neutral restaurant. When mother and daughter embraced for the first time in over 3 years, the connection felt immediate. "We were wrong," Elena said simply. "Your father was wrong, and I was wrong to let him speak for both of us. A parent's love should never be conditional." Rachel listened carefully, weighing her mother's words against years of pain. "I built a new life, Mama. If you want to be part of it, it has to be on our terms." Elena eagerly accepted any conditions. Rachel shared stories of Hope's development, her laughter, her bond with Margaret. Elena listened with tears, absorbing details about the granddaughter she'd missed knowing. 3 days later, Rachel invited Elena to Sunday dinner at Margaret's house. The afternoon was awkward initially, but Hope's natural charm quickly won over her biological grandmother. Elena watched Margaret and Hope's interaction with admiration rather than jealousy. "You've done a beautiful job raising her," Elena told Margaret. "Thank you for being there when we weren't." Margaret graciously responded, "Hope has room in her heart for many people who love her." Over time, Elena became a respectful presence in Hope's life, eventually earning the title Abuela. The relationship between Rachel and Elena required counseling and patience, but both women committed to healing old wounds. By Hope's 3rd birthday, their household had expanded to include Elena as an additional grandmother figure. Hope thrived, with multiple sources of love, developing confidence from knowing many people valued her existence. Margaret's art studio became a gathering place where 3 generations shared stories and created memories. Elena contributed her culinary skills, preparing traditional Mexican dishes that connected Hope to her heritage. The little girl learned Spanish lullabies from Abuela while painting watercolor flowers with gamma. "Look, Mama," Hope would exclaim, showing off a new skill learned from one of her grandmothers. Whether it was Elena's empanadas or Margaret's brush techniques, Hope absorbed knowledge eagerly from both women, Dr. Hendricks observed during routine. Checkups how this unique family structure benefited everyone involved. Hope has the emotional security that comes from knowing multiple adults are invested in her well-being, she noted. This is how children develop resilience. The old Victorian house buzzed with constant activity now. Elena's weekly visits brought fresh ingredients and family recipes, while Margaret's daily presence provided stability and artistic inspiration. Rachel worked part-time at Rosie's, confident that Hope was receiving exceptional care from women who genuinely loved her. Community members often commented on their unusual but successful arrangement. "That little girl is the luckiest child in Millbrook," observed Rosie Chun. "3 mothers raising one baby with more love than most families can manage." Hope's bedtime routine involved stories from all 3 women: Rachel's tales of brave princesses, Margaret's adventures of magical paintbrushes, and Elena's folklore about dancing skeletons and clever rabbits. The child fell asleep surrounded by voices that had chosen to love her unconditionally. As Hope grew older, she accepted her family structure as perfectly normal. When preschool friends asked why she had 3 mothers, Hope would simply explain, "Because I needed lots of love, so they all decided to help." The morning glories continued climbing Margaret's porch, opening fresh each dawn as symbols of renewal. Like the family they sheltered, they proved beautiful things grew from unexpected places, creating joy where emptiness once existed. 5 years after Hope's birth, Rachel stood in the same spot where she had first met Margaret, watching her daughter chase butterflies in the garden. The transformation seemed impossible, from desperate teenager to confident mother, surrounded by a chosen family who celebrated every milestone. Hope had started kindergarten that fall, proudly telling her teacher about her 3 mothers and confusing classmates with stories of Gama's paintings and Abuela's cooking lessons. The teacher, Mrs. Davidson, quickly understood the special nature of Hope's upbringing and often commented on the child's remarkable emotional intelligence and security. "Hope shows exceptional empathy for her age," Mrs. Davidson told Rachel during parent conferences. "Children raised with multiple sources of unconditional love often develop stronger social skills and greater confidence in forming relationships." Rachel's own journey continued evolving. She had completed her GED through night classes and begun taking business courses at the community college, dreaming of eventually opening her own catering business with Elena. Margaret encouraged these ambitions, often watching Hope during evening classes and celebrating each academic achievement. "Education delayed isn't education denied," Margaret would say, helping Rachel study at the kitchen table after Hope's bedtime. "You're showing your daughter that growth never stops." The house itself had become a landmark of sorts in Millbrook. Neighbors pointed it out to visitors as an example of how kindness could transform lives. The story of the pregnant girl who found sanctuary with a lonely widow had spread throughout the community, inspiring other acts of unexpected generosity. Elena had moved to Millbrook permanently the previous year, purchasing a small cottage 3 blocks away. This allowed her to be fully present in Hope's daily life while maintaining the healthy boundaries that kept their arrangement harmonious. Sunday dinners at Margaret's remained sacred family time, but Elena could now provide daily support when needed. "We've created something extraordinary," Elena reflected during one of these gatherings, watching Hope help Margaret prepare canvases for painting. "A family built on choice rather than obligation, stronger because we all chose to be here." The morning glories that climbed Margaret's porch continued their daily cycle of opening and closing, symbols of renewal and hope that bloomed fresh each day. Like the family they sheltered, they proved that beautiful things could grow in unexpected places, creating joy where once there had been only emptiness. Rachel's journey from abandoned teenager to confident mother surrounded by chosen family was complete, but the story continued evolving each day. Hope would grow up knowing that love came in many forms, that family could be created through choice as well as birth, and that kindness had the power to transform the most desperate circumstances into sources of lasting joy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.